Well, I think if you take the British public as a whole, Britain is not a very anti-Semitic country. In fact, I mean, not wanting to minimise the anti-Semitism that does exist here, on the whole, I think Britain is probably the best place that Jews have ever lived in their diaspora history, if you like. So I think, generally speaking, Britain isn't anti-Semitic. However, it's important to note that in the British Muslim community, various polls have shown, or repeated polls have shown, the levels of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish hatred are much, much higher than in the population at large. And it would appear that the people involved in this particular assault, the apparent perpetrators, would seem to have been from a Muslim background because they used various Arabic curse gestures and things like that. So I think that really is a big part of the story.
Well, of course, it's a problem and a great concern. How do you think it could best be tackled?
Well, that is a very, very difficult question indeed. I think that, one big thing that helps is when there's a public outcry. And, that's during the Corbyn years when anti-Semitism, began to fester in Labour and grow. I think it was really destroyed because the public basically became aware of it and had had enough. And the stronger public feeling was against the anti-Semitism in Labour, the more difficult it became to sustain at the ballot box. And I think that the more people speak out against anti-Semitism and stand up for Jewish people, the more taboo it becomes and the more people become aware of what anti-Semitism is, what constitutes it. And sooner or later, the message will get through to people in the Muslim community who hold anti-Semitic views as well as everybody else, that it isn't acceptable in society and you can't go around being open with these sorts of views at the very least. And hopefully from that point on, it will begin to reduce further. But this is something that's, it's been around for thousands of years. It isn't going to ever go away completely.
A lot of focus on the Black Lives Matter movement in the last couple of years. What's your view of how the media reports anti-Semitism in this country?
Well, it feels to me as if we live in a society where there's a very, very intense focus on anti-black racism, anti-Asian racism, to the extent that even if you don't realise you're being racist, or even if you're not being racist in terms of your motivation, using the wrong word or the wrong phrase or expressing a taboo opinion is somehow offensive, and there's a great furore about it. We saw that with Michael Vaughan, for example, a comment that he made in 2009, which Azim Rafiq said to me that he acknowledged was not malicious. Nonetheless, the England captain's being held to account for it. And yet when it comes to anti-Semitism, this sort of stuff happens in the street. And that's where the bar is for anti-Semitism. It's not a microaggression. It's not using the wrong term. It's not, unconscious bias. This is pretty damn conscious. This is actual naked race aggression and race hatred on Oxford Street. So it feels like in order for it to come to people's attention and provoke the sort of outrage that we now are seeing, it needs to be pretty bad. And a lot of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, passes people by because the radar is not so kind of carefully calibrated as it is for even the smallest notion of anti-black prejudice.
Well, it strikes me that anti-Semitism has to be reframed in the national conversation as racism.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that anti-Semitism has its own term, and it's a species of racism, but it's not the same as racism because it has unique characteristics. I mean, one of those characteristics, for example, is that in the mind of the anti-Semite, or in a mind that has some anti-Semitic assumptions somewhere in it, there's a sense that Jews are very powerful. They're somehow pulling strings behind the scenes or controlling the world's media, or just very affluent or very well connected or something like that. And so therefore, if you have that assumption, then you're being prejudiced against Jews in some way, or disliking Jews, or being, sort of feeling uncomfortable about Jews. It feels reasonable because you're kind of punching up. You know what I mean? You're sort of, you're just reacting against a powerful oppressive force, which is, And in actual fact, of course, the whole premise of that is wrong. Jews are not behind, putting the strings behind the scenes, and aren't in charge of the banking system, and aren't in charge of the media and all the rest of it. But that's how anti-Semitism is framed. It's a very peculiar form of racism, whereas other forms of racism, you don't have quite the same sense. Anti-black racism isn't justified in the mind of the racist by punching up against a powerful force. It's very much punching down. And so anti-Semitism has a specific history. It has the history of the Holocaust as well, which other racisms don't have, and specific characteristics. But your point is very valid in that it should be taken as seriously as other kinds of racism. And so in that way, recognizing that it is racism puts it in that same bracket, and is an important step as well.